Welcome to the Fenton Forecast. I'm your host, David Fenton. My guest today has studied the digital infrastructure of persuasion of the Christian nationalist right. And it is extensive. You've heard of Charlie Kirk, and perhaps you've heard of Jubilee and PragerU. This is a massive online infrastructure of influence. When we talk about they in this interview, that's who we're talking about. And they have invested mightily in creating these influencers that are reaching people every day. And this is now how most people get their information, is through so-called parasocial influencers that they have a relationship of trust with on their phone. And I'm afraid that the white Christian nationalist movement has built up much, much more of this than any progressives have. It's a tremendous imbalance. I would call this, on our side, a unilateral information war, disarmament. So Laura has studied this infrastructure for 20 years. She's gone to their conferences. She's making a movie about them. And frankly, if we don't build up our own influence infrastructure, these people are going to keep having way too much political influence in our country. So over to my interview with Laura Dawn.
Hi, I'm Laura Dawn Murphy. I am the co-founder of Art Not War. We are a creative agency that has been around now since 2012. We've worked for over 62 NGOs and just not-for-profits around the world. We work solely on not-for-profit social justice campaigns. And we try to say that we try to work on the most existential problems. We like to try to solve the deepest problems if we can. We work a lot on climate, nuclear nonproliferation, and I've known David for a long time because I began my career as the creative and cultural director at MoveOn.org, where I got the chance to work with David, with yourself, for, I don't know, like a decade.
Laura Dawn, welcome to the Fenton Forecast. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you, as always.
Let's see, we've known each other now since, 2001 or something like that?
2002.
Laura was working for MoveOn.org as it was trying to stop the Iraq invasion.
Yes.
And I was too, and that's how we met. But that was long ago. And the reason I wanted to talk to you, Laura, is because you have been a student of the, I would say, media dominant right on digital media and online, and in particular the Christian right. Yeah. And you've gone to their conferences, you've met them, you've been studying what makes them effective, how they're getting such a huge and important following, how they're thereby influencing politics and worldview and culture and events. And, this is kind of the story of our time. And, I think people don't understand this is not only a question of Fox News or Joe Rogan. It goes much deeper than that.
Yes.
So Laura, tell us why you decided to study this and what did you find?
Well, so as you have mentioned, I've been doing this for, 22 plus years. We've been both working together in one way or another on culture and communications. And after 2016, I really, as so many people, I think, had a moment of reckoning. And I wish more people had this particular moment, but my big moment was, what are we doing wrong? How did we get this wrong? What are we
Trump
doing?
won?
Trump won. Trump beat Hillary Clinton in an election that shouldn't even have been close. And prior to that, I've been online doing campaigns since 2002. I was running a couple different campaigns, and I was running a big campaign called Humanity for Hillary. And I was seeing things online that I'd never seen before. One, I was seeing the left turn on itself in a way that I'd never experienced before, viciously turn on itself. And I saw just tons and tons of content that seemed to be inflaming that. And then I also, this was back when they first started, the whole QAnon thing took off. I was running this big social channel, Humanity for Hillary. We ended up on some list on the dark web. We were being inundated every single day with bots and trolls or people that felt real, but then you would click through and it would look like a soccer mom from Florida, and then it would turn out that the soccer mom from Florida was also on what was then Twitter, tweeting about how Ukraine should belong to Russia. So you're just like, okay, some other level of thing is happening here. And this, of course, was when our campaign got hacked and we found people with email addresses from Cambridge Analytica in the back end of our system. Again, we'd never heard of that. So this sort of just got me wondering, and I reached out to some friends who were very, very high up in product marketing, who had worked for, cigarette companies and who had made lots of money doing all kinds of high-level marketing stuff. And I said, come in and take a look and actually, can I connect you with some of our clients, some of the different organizations that we work with? And so they did sort of like a full examination and came back and said, the progressive movement is 10 years behind basic marketing techniques. There are war room techniques that have been employed for a long time, which are rapidly escalating. And it's really clear that the Trump campaign used some of these techniques, and it's really clear that you're way behind. And so I thought, oh, that's really interesting. I want to know everything about this. So for the past 5 years, I have been directing a feature documentary called Crazy for God. And it is about the origins of the Christian nationalist movement that is, severely infiltrated the U.S. federal government. Starting all the way back in the 1970s with a, not well-known theologian outside of evangelical circles, but very well-known within evangelical circles, a theologian called Francis Schaeffer, who I think was arguably the Promethean spark of a lot of the thought leadership that has led us to this moment. And the past 5 years has taken me into all kinds of different interesting arenas. But the one thing I started noticing over and over again when I spoke to people within this movement was how much they talked about worldview. And in fact, I went to one of their gatherings, the Pray Vote Lead Summit in DC. And, Trump was there, and DeSantis. It was sort of like 2,000 of the most influential pastors in this movement. And before they started their sort of rock concert that led to Trump speaking, they had, I think, a PhD in religious history, maybe just a PhD in religion. They had a man named Os Guinness, who was the right hand of Francis Schaeffer, stand up and basically give almost an academic lecture on worldview, on the shared worldview that was uniting them all in this moment. And I just thought to myself, I have been to so many gatherings of Democrats and progressives, and I've never seen any gathering started with this statement of shared purpose. This is what we believe. This is our conception of reality. And it's not just like a platform of what they believe. It literally is a shared conception of reality.
It's an inculcation in their view of morality.
That's right. I mean, the thing that this all really led to for me was worldview. That's probably the number one thing I talk about now.
So explain what you mean by that and what role it plays in these digital information battles.
So I love to say, we think that we're having an argument about two separate political parties or a particular way of legislating, a particular way of leading. Those are all the topical issues. Underneath, we're really having an argument about the nature of reality.
So what defines their worldview in reality?
So the right wing's worldview, it just sort of tightly weaves like political, legislative, cultural strategies all into one cohesive thing. And billions of dollars has gone into building this narrative that merges religion and economics and culture into this one cohesive story. So what is the story? It's about natural law, this hierarchical, individualistic, and divinely ordained natural order. And any challenge to that order from climate action to multiculturalism is framed as existentially dangerous. And this worldview is the foundation of the right-wing media machine. And I mean, if you want to get more granular, like deeper into it, it's basically the idea. They talk a lot about objective and subjective reality, right? So their position, their worldview is that all objective reality is based on the existence of an omniscient God. Everything springs from there. And the Bible, and obviously there's many interpretations of the Bible. There's like thousands and thousands of different denominations of Christianity, but there's a shared purpose behind this movement, even though there's also within Christian nationalism, like 3 big factions and probably more, right? But the shared worldview at this point is that objective reality resides on the existence of an omniscient God, and that everything has to be stacked. All of culture, all of politics, everything has to be stacked under natural law, which means God the Father, and then sort of like a ruling class of elite religious men, or perhaps tech giants, this ruling class of men, right? And then there's all men, and then there's women, and then there's children, and then there's animals in the natural world. And if you talk to someone from within this worldview, they'll say, you liberals always say, like, why don't you care about poverty? Well, we care about poverty very much. We just don't believe that government intervention is what will solve poverty. What will solve poverty is when the world is returned to natural law. They care about the same things that we care about. They just don't agree that we have a bead on how to solve those things. They think that by restoring the United States, first and foremost, but then of course the world, to natural law and to a shared reality under an omniscient God, that's the way to create peace on earth. That's the way to solve all these deeper problems that we think that we're going to solve with social programs, right? So this kind of produced my first aha moment, which is, we're reading all these books over the years, What's the Matter with Kansas, which is a great book. Lots and lots of chatter, like what's wrong with these people who are voting against their self-interest. And I just had this aha moment where I realized, oh, they're not voting against their self-interest. We don't understand what their self-interest actually is. We don't understand what their primary self-interest is. This is why you can spend so much money targeting somebody with ads after ads after ads. And you did all your research, you checked the messages. They care about economic messages. Economic messages are going to move this person, this percent, and then they still vote for the person who won't enact any of the legislation that would achieve the things that they said that they cared about when you did the pre and post survey, right? So it's because you're not going to get somebody to vote against their worldview if they have a primary interest, which is spiritual and which is about a conception of reality. Even if they care about solar panels making their monthly bills cheaper, even if they say they care about that, they're not going to vote with you because they're not going to vote against their spiritual beliefs about abortion or about the secular left. So the concurrent thing that they've been building all this time, right? They have their worldview, this idea of objective reality. Well, the enemy of that is subjective reality, and that is the secular left. The secular left are defined as people who believe that all morality is subjective. It comes from within us. Each person gets to decide for themselves what they believe to be true, right? And they find this very dangerous because if we all, the way that they tease it out, I'm not saying that I agree with this, but the way that they tease it out is if each person gets to decide for themselves where that inevitably leads, and this is Francis Schaeffer was the theologian that I'm making the film about, was a big proponent of this, but this inevitably, it leads to nihilism. It leads to despair. He called it the crossing the line of despair because it means that all of existence is meaningless. And they just cannot accept that our existence is meaningless. And if you believe in the reality of an omniscient God, if you believe that you're living in a supernatural world, then the secular left is your enemy. And in fact, some circles go so far as to say that the secular left is under either demonic control or demonic influence.
By that, they mean us.
That is correctly. That is correct. They mean anybody that exists.
You don't look demonic to me, Laura.
Yeah, but I mean, I think at their most charitable moments, they'll say that secular humanists are under demonic influence. It's we might be good people, we might believe what we believe fervently, and we believe that we're trying to help the poor with governmental policies, and we believe this, but it's really demonic influence that's pushing us.
You need an exorcist.
Yeah. They also go to a lot of links, and there's many books written on this that they also talk about. They do believe that the United States is a sort of, divinely inspired nation.
City on a hill.
That it is the city on the hill, that it was founded to be a Christian nation, even though there's so much evidence that it wasn't. Our founding fathers were very articulate about the separation of church and state.
But
Their
these
private letters
want the church to be the state. So, Laura, I want to ask you, so that's their worldview. In a minute, we'll talk about how we don't have a coherent one in response. But tell me about how they propagate it. What's the structure? How do they do it?
Well, in 2016, something happened where the technology got to a certain place, and Cambridge Analytica, I think, was the first group that really broke ground here with micro-targeting, with a whole new level of psychographic targeting based on millions and millions of data points. The algorithm. Back then, when we first started talking about this in 2016, people were like, oh, that can't possibly be true. Now I think people are starting to understand that the algorithm may know you better than you know yourself. And this is based on a collection of millions and millions of data points. So they're collecting it on you as you go through your life. And the more time you spend online, the more data that they collect. And you become easier and easier to target and persuade. And they also went into a lot of, trouble to find out who was the most persuadable and how. And one of the things that Cambridge Analytica did, and I'm so sure is still happening to this day, is finding people that there's a whole kind of like psychographic analysis, like a personality matrix or, analysis, right? An analysis of personality on this matrix. And they were looking for people that they called high neurosis. But basically that means people who were in pain, people who were going through a divorce, people who were dealing with addiction, people who were dealing with bereavement, with grief, with loss, especially men, especially young men. So people who are lost, they found easier to push towards authoritarian beliefs and perceptions, sometimes through the guise of ministering to them, which is not to say two things can be true at once. There can be people within that constellation of events that actually believe they're ministering to people who are lost and who need help. But then that data is also used to push them towards Trump, towards an authoritarian, towards the political party.
See this in a person. Perceive threats to their identity, culture, morality is predominant in how people vote. And George Lakoff pointed this out decades ago, the great linguist, and wrote a book about it called Moral Politics. And yet, many Democrats still say, well, just talk about affordability. And, sure, talk about affordability, but if you only talk about that, you're going to lose because people don't just vote on economics. So, Laura, I want to get more into worldview later, but I think people don't quite understand what we're up against. So this is why I'd like you to please lay out what is their infrastructure? How do they propagate all this? How dominant is it? How big is it? How many people do they reach? Who are their top influences? What are their top institutions? And then let's talk about how we have so little in return.
They put a ton of money into talent. Anyone who seems talented can get a lot of support that's aligned with that worldview. And they have just grown this force, and it is an interconnected forest. So they have, this interconnected forest of verticals, and some of them are not-for-profits, and some of them are media companies, and most of them are driven with a parasocial influence. Parasocial meaning like you develop a relationship with the person that you're seeing online because you're spending so much time with them. So I think one of the most important verticals within that right-wing media ecosystem is PragerU. At this point, 1 out of 3 Americans online have seen a PragerU video. They reached 1 billion views in 2018, and by 2022, I think 7 billion views, at least by their report. And I'm not sure what it is now, but the last time I looked, it was something like an estimated average of 40 million plus views a month. And over 60% of their audience is under 35. And they have they've done an amazing job. I'm just going to say it. They've done an amazing job of creating this wider content funnel. And by the way, the PragerU videos, when I first saw them pop up, I said, oh, they're copying what we've been doing at Move On. We started this direct address explainer video series with Robert Reich. And we actually started before Robert Reich, and then Robert Reich really made it sing. We had mini viral videos with this kind of approach, right? And there were many proposals to take that bigger, to make a media company out of it, and nobody on the left funded it. And, there was an opportunity there to do exactly what PragerU did. PragerU saw what we did, saw that it was successful, and did exactly what should have been done, which is put a ton of money into getting a wide, diverse group of very talented people on camera, not just one person, but a whole bunch of people, right? That could appeal to much different audiences. That's what it is to have a wider content funnel. If you only have one person, if you put all your cookies in one basket, it's not going to work. They're not going to appeal to everybody. So they started making and just churning out these 5-minute explainer videos. And then, of course, finding what would work, doubling down on what worked. I think they hit the ground running with a $10 million a year operating budget, which you're like, you're like, do you know what I would do with a $10 million operating budget? We could have changed the world. But I can't think of any content operation similar on the left that's put that kind of money behind just making videos and building a brand. So PragerU have been incredibly successful. Now they are now curriculum in 10 states. And they're unofficially part of the supplemental curriculum in many, many more states. There's lawsuits all up and down California of parents who have found their content being promoted by teachers pretty much unknowingly, because like I said, it's a very, very intelligent and smart marketing it's a smart marketing maneuver to have the widest possible content funnel. What I mean by that is, okay, they have a thing called Prager Kids, and they make children's books. If you received a children's book from Prager Kids on, say, MLK Jr., it's completely unimpeachable. I mean, it's a fantastically made book. It's bright, it's colorful. There's nothing in the content that would give you pause whatsoever. You could give that to your 3rd grader and just be rest assured it's a great book about MLK Jr. But what is on the cover of the book? Prager Kids. And if they go on YouTube, as so many kids are doing these days, and they discover a Prager Kids video, which looks just like their favorite book about MLK Jr., it is only a hop, skip, and a jump till they are led towards more and more content that's going to reinforce a right-wing point of view. They may then land on a PragerU video featuring Candace Owens, a hugely successful right-wing, far right-wing influencer who, again, got her career jump-started. Lots of cross-pollination. PragerU, Ben Shapiro, all these different people appeared in PragerU videos. Doing a video, Candace's video is on the history of slavery. The last time I looked, I think it had over 10 million views. And, you might be surprised to learn in this video on the history of slavery that it wasn't that bad. It wasn't that bad. And in fact, it was, white people who ended slavery. So, if you really want to see the kind of stuff that they do, go check that out. They also very smartly have a whole economics series that's actually pretty well done. So they're doing stuff, video content that could hook somebody in that's more moderate, that's questioning, maybe even a couple of things that might hook somebody in that's a little further to the left, and they're drawing you back. That's what a content funnel is. I'm picking you up here, but I'm drawing you down to a worldview through this deluge of content. It's really smart what they're doing. They're running it really, really well. Again, started with 10 million a year, 5 million on production. I think they were spending about 25,000 per video, 5 million on distribution. Nothing like that to this day still exists anywhere left of center.
How is PragerU funded? Who's behind it? Where's the money from, and how big is it?
Is huge. So Dennis Prager's a billionaire. I think that it started, as I understand it, per their records, they started with 10 million right out of the gate. They had 5 million on a staff of 42 in downtown LA that were spending about approximately 25K per video. They were churning out these 5-minute videos. They had 5 million for distribution. PragerU was founded in 2009, but it took them a very long time to really understand what they were doing. They were churning out videos. They weren't really connecting. They finally brought on this new marketing. She's very smart marketing, accomplished marketing woman to run this. And they divvied up this 5 million for production, 5 million for distribution. And they finally started getting millions of views. And then it just became a juggernaut, and it's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And the last time we looked, I think their operating budget was something like 60 million a year. But it's just worth noting that, like, I can't think of anything on our left of center side that, first of all, was given a number of years to learn and grow and to make, to fail, right? How do we do this? How do we break through? So they were given a number of years of support to figure out what they were doing. Once they were really connecting, the idea that you would have $10 million a year to spend on content and distribution as a starting point is kind of unheard of. That's just not something that
on the
is
progressive side. So
Yeah.
they get 60 million views. They have the huge staff. They have tens of millions of dollars. They're affecting culture and knowledge and politics. They're very visible repetitively. And do we have anything close with a progressive point of view? We'll talk about what a progressive worldview should be in a minute, but just structurally, do we have anything close?
No. Well, first of all, just to slight correction, 7 billion views is where they're at now.
I got it.
So
right.
7 billion views. And no, there's been one great project launched in the past couple of years called More Perfect Union.
Right.
And I'm really proud. I mean, I don't know them, but I'm really proud of that whole group. They're doing very, very well. And they're doing it the way that it should be done. The difference is, and this is a really big difference, if I put together a map for you and I showed you our side, you'd see More Perfect Union. And if I showed you their side, you would see there's 1,000 points to like, and 100. So we have one thing that's been pretty well funded. I can't disclose what their operating budget is. I think that they at least started with a couple million a year. I don't know what it is now. You should have somebody from More Perfect Union on because they're really doing it well. But the point is, you don't just fund one thing,
Right.
You can't just fund Pod Save America and More Perfect Union and call it a day. You have to have a grand vision.
Ecosystem of influencers.
How to build an entire ecosystem of not just influencers, but because the way that we do influencers is very different than the way that they do influencers as well. You have to have this entire parasocial network. This is the other piece of this. They not only built this larger infrastructure of media companies, but they poured money into parasocial influence. For anybody who doesn't know what parasocial means,
define that term, would you?
It's having a relationship with somebody online that's ongoing, somebody that
Who you
feel
trust.
who you trust as a human being. You don't even have to agree with them on everything. You just trust that they're a human being that you know.
Right.
This is
And
why
this
somebody back.
and people in our community don't seem to understand. This is now the predominant way most people get information.
It is growing every year as the predominant way that most people get their information. They distrust large institutions. People are not interacting with legacy media in the same way. And you have individual media companies and individual influencers possessing a tremendous
So they have hundreds of them, and
Yeah.
you hardly have any. So
Well, we have influencers, but it's a different approach. So our approach is really an extension of what I call push media, right? there's still, there are organizations that are funded from large donors. They do some message testing. They come up with a series of messages or talking points that they believe to be true based on their study, like, oh, people are more interested in climate if they're talking about their economic self-interest. So we should test media that talks about how using solar will lessen their the weight on their pocketbook, or pocketbook issues, blah blah blah. They do that level of study, and then they get those talking points, and they say, we're going to do influencers too. We're going to do paid media, and we're going to do influencers. So we're going to send out those talking points to all these influencers. Here, I hired a company. They have 1,000 influencers, and I asked them all to do a thing with these talking points. And they happily take the money and they do it. And their algorithm goes like this. And they do your little thing on pocketbook issues on solar. It goes, and then the next day it goes back up like this.
Right.
So
in other words, hardly anybody sees it.
So basically you just paid for an ad from an influencer. And everybody that was watching that influencer knows that that's what that was.
In other words, it's not authentic. So it's not building trust.
It's basically just an extension of push media. It's top-down media. It's top-down media distribution.
That's what progressives and liberals are doing.
That's what a lot of people in the Democratic side of the equation do. On the right, they have invested in influencers as media companies in and of themselves.
Right.
We're living right now what I like to call the age of parasocial communications. So the whole structure of how we got and shared information completely changed. And there's just like a whole lot of people on our side, again, holding on to this old model, this sort of like paid or earned media model, this idea that there's sort of gatekeepers, there's legacy media, as they call it. That's like your New York Times and all your different big papers, and your legacy media, CBS News, and all the different ways that, as we were all growing up, there were the ways that we got information. All of that's been completely upended. It's really not how the vast majority of people get information anymore. And increasingly, because there's so much of a deluge of information, people are relying on people that they see as human. I always say that the currency is going to be trust. It's not going to be like attention minutes. It's going to be trust. Attention minutes are important too, but trust, you have to be hearing from someone that you trust. Now, anyone who's done old school organizing knows that this is the most effective organizing. Peer-to-peer relational organizing, that works better than anything. When you hear from your neighbors or your family, those people are going to be a deeper influence on you than anyone else. So when you start spending time with somebody online, somebody like Joe Rogan or anyone that you're spending time with online, especially if they are brave enough to present themselves as a multifaceted, flawed human being, the more real they are to you, the more you start to listen, and you can be influenced by them. And that's really something that the right wing heavily invested in. They heavily invested in building up parasocial relationships, but seeing those parasocial figures as media companies. They didn't see Ben Shapiro just as Ben Shapiro. They built an entire media company around him. And that is something that we just haven't done. Not anywhere at the scale of the far right.
There are more of them. They're more authentic. They speak more from the heart. They speak to moral values. They're not just trying to put across information in a cold way. So we're very outgunned. And look at the consequences. You still have, even now, Trump has a 37% approval rating. Imagine 37% of the people in this country are fooled by this obvious liar con man. And this is a big part of why, because this is an alternative reality that is maintained for large parts of the population who now get most of their information from these digital parasocial influencers. And we, that means liberals and progressives, are practicing what I would call unilateral information disarmament. We're basically leaving the playing field to them, and then we're surprised at the result. So Laura, I wanted to ask you, why do you think they are so much more focused on mass communication and persuasion than our do-gooder friends? Why?
I've asked myself that question a lot. The one thing that they also are is very interested in a way that for some reason most of the folks on our side are not interested in the actual sort of in-depth psychological underpinnings of how to convince somebody of something.
Right.
I see a lot of deep study on the right. And a lot of philosophy guiding that study, a lot of psychology guiding that study, because I think that they know and understand that it's really important if you want to win, and they're very driven to win. They're very ideologically driven to win. On our side, there still seems to be a reluctance to do that, a feeling that somehow that's immoral or unethical, right? They accept that we're running advertising, which is an attempt to shape how somebody feels or to push somebody towards a different point of view. So if you're already accepting that you're engaging in that, you're engaging in communication with somebody in an effort to lead them towards a different belief or perception or behavior, right? If you're trying to get somebody to vote for somebody, that is what you're doing. If you accept that, then why wouldn't you want to use every tool at your disposal to achieve that?
Well, it's
But for some
interesting,
reason,
that's a very good point. They're willing to, our side will invest in communications during an election because there's a measurable outcome and it's short term. But the more important work, you and I would argue, of shaping opinion and worldviews and understanding in the years leading up to the election, which determines what happens in the election, they don't engage in that. So
no. And there seems to be a belief that it's somehow unethical to do so. I mean, this is something, and by the way, this isn't like me positing this. I run up against this over and over and over again. I actually do, I do consulting. I design campaigns for all kinds of different organizations. And over again, the smartest stuff, the stuff that I know will work the best, gets shot down by campaign teams because it doesn't fit with this paradigm of, we tested this message, we're going to hit this message over and over again, and this feels unethical to do.
So let's talk about that, because that's a very key thing that this audience, I hope, is really going to think about. So back to the great Berkeley linguist George Lakoff, who's written about this, and he has a very interesting theory about what's going on here. So he says that people that go to business school, they study marketing and cognitive science, and most of them, to advance their careers, have to sell products and services. So they have a natural orientation to focus on public opinion, public demand, in order to succeed in their careers and sell their products and services.
And how to create public demand.
That's right, which is what advertising does. For the air fresheners you don't need and all that nonsense. So meanwhile, this is perfectly natural to them. And they've also learned that by the manipulation of public opinion is a great investment, because they can spend $20 million and get a $5 billion tax break. So they're very focused on this. Now, on the other side is us, and most of us study the humanities, the sciences, and the law. And we are inculcated with what Lakoff calls the Enlightenment fallacy, that a great idea or policy or piece of science will always win because it's so intrinsically brilliant.
Yeah.
And it will reproduce itself and convince people in power because it's brilliant. It's a kind of an engineer's viewpoint.
Yeah.
And there's a core.
You shouldn't have to work so hard to sell it. It should sell itself.
Right.
I've heard that. I've heard that.
And there's a corollary subconscious view that comes with this Enlightenment fallacy, which is selling is dirty and manipulative and beneath us. And we don't do that kind of thing, even truthfully. Even to sell the truth is dirty and manipulative. I used to have this argument with George Soros all the time. I would try to get him to invest in these kinds of media campaigns. And he would say, well, that's manipulation, like, my youth growing up under Hitler and Stalin. And I'd have to say, George, that's demanipulating. They've been manipulated. We need to get them the truth. We can't just hope that it happens. So this is a huge mismatch. And I think, explains a lot about why you can't raise money to do these campaigns, and PragerU can, because they're business people.
Well, they understand the psychology, and they also, again, back to worldview, if you believe fervently that putting people that agree with your worldview into power is actually going to save the world, is going to create peace, is going to restore natural law, right? If that's something you believe, right? Then you're not worried as much about the ends justify the means is I think very, very true on the right.
Sure.
And getting ever more true. I think that they really believe that anything they do, and there's even a line of philosophical and like thought that includes, biblical, in their terms, substantiation of this idea that the ends justify the means, and anything that you do in the service of returning this country and the world to God is actually legitimate.
Including fascism.
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, this is not a movement that believes in democracy.
Right.
This is not a movement no, they believe in, that at some point someone called it theocratic libertarianism, which I thought was pretty funny because I don't think that those things go well together. But it's certainly a theocratic movement. They want to keep the sort of trappings of the democracy as long as they're actually in control of it. Okay. And I think when you get into the technology, the sort of technate side of this, when you have the influence of Peter Thiel and, I don't think that any of those folks, I think that they're all just sort of very strange bedfellows right now. I think that they're really utilizing the Christian nationalists to continue to entrench power amongst a very, very small ruling class of men.
The way Nixon did.
Yeah, but with so much more money. I mean, the difference between the amount of money and control during Nixon's era and now, I think, is vast. I don't think the world has never seen anything like a small group of trillionaires, which is, a handful of men that are worth more than any nation state. This is a new thing in the history of the world.
And as James Talarico, the candidate on the Democratic side for Senate in Texas, says, these billionaires are using their algorithms to divide us.
Yes.
And to manipulate us, and they're very good at it. And right now they're predominant. So Lori, you talk about the importance of worldview. So you've explained what theirs is. You know it up close. You've gone to their meetings. You've passed for one of them. You're a nice girl from Iowa. You were able to fool them. I can't wait to see your movie about the Christian right. So what do you think a more conscious expression of a progressive and humanist worldview in America should be? How would you define it?
Well, we did quite a bit of thinking on that, and we've tested it to a certain extent. And we did a project called Bold Rethink, which was meant to be stood up as a PragerU type educational vertical. And, it tested incredibly well. The folks at Swayable said that it redefined what they thought was possible in terms of persuasion. Right. So, and that's a testing platform.
So what's the worldview?
The basis of the worldview that we boiled it down to, because we looked at the tenets of an open society. I think there's like 17. We didn't want to get, as can so often happen in progressive spaces, we didn't want to get this giant comprehensive thing. So we boiled it down to three things. One is multicultural, multiracial pluralism, right?
Democracy, the other is multiracial democracy.
Multiracial democracy. Certainly democracy. Now, literally, when you say this, some people are like, well, democracy doesn't test that well. Well, our current democracy doesn't test that well. But if you ask people whether they want to be ruled over by an autocrat or a theocrat or a dictator, or they want to exist in a country where the government exists with the consent of the governed, they choose that. So they just don't like the way this democracy is going, because I don't know if anyone's noticed, but it's not going so well. So this has not been a very healthy democracy for a while, and people are noting that. But I do think people want democracy. And so multiracial democracy. And then we say sustainability. So it's not just about climate. It means all of our lives have to be sustainable. And that's a very large bucket. That includes health care. That includes the natural environment. That includes economic inequality. everything has to be sustainable for future generations to come. And anything that works against that, I don't think is part of our worldview. So those are the basic three pillars. And if I had to add one more thing, it would be interfaith tolerance. I think that the idea that there isn't like a multi-million dollar campaign just promoting interfaith tolerance, not only in this country but worldwide, is a shame.
I would say interfaith respect more than tolerance.
Interfaith respect, tolerance.
You could even call it love.
Even love. People of faith have more in common than they think. And if we could slowly move society away from this idea of quibbling over minutia, over interpretation of scripture. We have like 3 giant major religions all under the same God who are constantly at war with each other. It doesn't make any sense. So I have never seen any kind of large scale say, I know there are interfaith groups, I know there are interfaith organizations, but what I'm talking about is using the kinds of communication techniques that billions are being pumped into micro-targeted media designed to divide us and inflame us. And those same billions could be pumped into micro-targeted media that is designed to bring us together.
And it works.
It's doing that.
Well, there is somebody doing it, not without the billions. If you're following James Talarico, the candidate for Senate in Texas,
Right.
He has a great way of putting this, right? He says, my father was a Baptist preacher, and he told us we follow a barefoot rabbi who gave us 2 commandments, love God and love thy neighbor. And then he says, and they're the same thing because every one of your neighbors is holy. They're all made by God, and whatever their faith or their color or their gender or their sexual proclivity, it doesn't matter. They're all holy. You have to love them all. And that's real Christianity. Yeah. And he's surging and attracting independent voters and some Trump voters with real Christianity. And so that's a worldview.
No, he's fantastic. I really, really support him. And this is the thing that I hope to explore. I really think that, if anyone sees my film, that hopefully will come out next spring called Crazy for God, the journey that you go on, I hope that that's where you lead. It's where I left after, it'll be 6 years by the time I'm done. Just this feeling that we have to invest everything we have in learning how to be tolerant, respectful, and loving with each other. And I know that sounds really simple, but it's actually really hard to do in practice. And I think people of faith have the best chance of actually stopping, which, this isn't hyperbole. We're in the middle of a massive global authoritarian takeover. Yep. It's taking over this superpower at the moment.
States.
It's spreading to the UK. It will spread across Europe. Many people in the UK and Europe are trying to pass legislation right now to ban or greatly corral American tech companies. What should that say to us when members of European Parliament are having emergency meetings to make sure that they can ban American tech companies from doing to their countries what they've done to this one?
For spreading all this falsehood on purpose to keep people on their platforms, to keep making money by destroying and dividing. Many of us think that this has got to be regulated. This is way too corrosive and is going to cause a collapse of society, the democracy, and the natural world the way we're going.
Yes. So, and it's doing, and just, while we're at it, I really encourage everyone to read The Anxious Generation. If you're a parent,
by Jonathan Haidt.
If you're a parent, there's a ton, and it's more and more studies are coming out all the time. Just follow his work. These screens and even educating through screens has been really disastrous for our kids. And so if we really care about future generations, we have to put the brakes on. And we cannot just give up everything that we've built as a human society to a handful of men with really dangerous tech companies who are operating with the kind of impunity. I mean, this is just...
They have no liability for what's on their platform.
No liability.
All the incentives are wrong. And, I had as a guest Tristan Harris from the Center for Humane Technology, who's a big critic of social media and AI, although he's pro the right kind of tech. And as he points out, the incentives are wrong. We change the incentives, we can make these platforms do some good in the world. But if the only incentive is maximizing eyeballs, maximizing conflict to maximize eyeballs, and doing it all to maximize profit for a very few group of people with no regulation, no social benefit built in or required, that's what Europe is pushing for. And a lot of people in our country don't understand that. That's a whole other discussion. So in terms of division, you and I have been very frustrated at ways that people in the progressive world tend to divide ourselves and to, the common term is wokeism, over wokeism. The strategy of rulers throughout history has been divide and conquer. And we feel that now in the progressive world, we're doing this to ourselves too much and losing sight of the need for unity against a common enemy. And you can only beat a common enemy by having essential unity. So talk about your experiences with that, Laura. Let's commiserate together.
Well, so one of the things that we discovered when we were doing the Bold Rethink platform, which anyone can go to boldrethink.org and see some of those videos, is that we were able to do a little bit of experimentation with what would actually work, right? And something that works is what we call validation first. I have two little catchphrases to share. One is validation first, and one is truth stacking. So we do both, and both have been tested really, really well. And some of the organizations, unfortunately too few that I've talked to about this, have been employing some of this, and it's been really, really effective. So validation first is so important for a very key reason. Validation first and truth stacking. Validation first is really something that came out of therapy. People use it in couples therapy. They use it as a therapeutic thing all the time.
I hear you.
The idea that you do not have to agree with someone to validate what they're experiencing, but just the act of validating what they're experiencing opens up a level and a channel of communication, right? That can lead you to greater understanding, that can lead you to a more peaceful outcome. So we went through, when we were working on some of these really tough subjects that we were trying to get conservative people to be open to, like the existence of systemic racism, or even like critical race theory. I mean, we made videos on everything. And the first thing we would look at is, what is their resistance to this? For instance, in the case of systemic racism, once we started talking to people who are of a more conservative bent, we kept hearing that they didn't, because there's been done in the entertainment world on representation, they see so much Black excellence in sports, on TV, in film, in music. They see Black billionaires, they see successful Black politicians. It does not register to them that there could be any systemic inequalities built. What do you mean systemic racism? We've solved that. So that's the first thing that we say. And because we talk about that first and we acknowledge how it could feel that way, conversation with us versus just hitting them overhead with our talking points that we researched and whittled down, right? So this is the big difference also with the conservative approach and the invest in Parasocial. I would actually like to argue, since we were talking about the ethical dilemma, the sort of ethical quandary on the center, the Democratic side, let's just say, I would argue that it is more unethical to spend millions of dollars running ads. First of all, they don't work the way that they used to. There is a real efficacy decay with running ads, right? People do not pay attention to ads in the same way. But the idea of getting somebody's attention and their dopamine snapped to your little 15-second ad, to me, is more unethical than spending the same amount of money developing a deeper relationship through a parasocial figure who may say things off of your talking point, who may have different interests. If you paid an influencer out there $150,000 a year to just make content and develop a relationship with a real audience, it would be infinitely more valuable than the $150 you will blow. By the way, paying Meta Who are you paying that money to? You're paying Mark Zuckerberg. You're paying the very people that you say are helping to destroy the country. You're spending all your ad dollars and putting them in the pockets of these billionaires versus giving money directly to somebody who could build up their own channel and their own realm of influence. The money would be infinitely better spent if every billionaire who funds the Democratic Party looked at the vast amount of money that they're giving and literally gave it to 100 influencers, paying just a basic salary for them over the next 10 years, keeping them all organized through worldview. In 10 years, we'd have something vastly more powerful than we have now, instead of all that money that they'll just
for sure.
bleed
It's
out
not
on the
working, in
next
case you
election.
haven't noticed. It's
Huh?
not working. It's not
It's
working.
not working,
It doesn't
but-
work anymore.
They're going to spend 80 million, 100 billion on the next election. And for what? If our candidate loses, it's all just poof gone versus the infrastructure of actual relationship they could be building.
Yeah, to bring along the public so that you can get congressional majorities, so you can have margins for permanent legislation rather than this, well, we won by one vote, which is the same as losing. But Laura, I want to get back
I want to say one last thing. I want to say one last thing. If we don't have a plan to get back in control of Congress and then to make deep, true changes, structural changes to this country, if there is no large-scale plan that is well-funded to do that, then I think everybody needs to light one up and enjoy the fascism. Because I'm telling you, they are very, 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 very organized and very well funded and know exactly what they're moving towards. And if we do not have a similar point of focus, which I have not seen, we seem to still be operating like, well, we'll just win the next election. We'll just win the next election. They don't care. If we manage to eke out a win of the House next fall, that'll be a tiny bit of a setback to them. But they talk about this. They sometimes used to call it like a 200-year plan until the technology evolved.
Well, the main thing is they build the infrastructure of persuasion, and we're allergic to that.
That's correct. That's a
So
good
you
way
were
to say it.
saying that you did this bold rethink testing. We were talking about
Oh, yeah.
self-division and wokeism. So what did you find?
So
You
validation.
have to validate. And
You
then
have to
what?
validate, and then there's a thing called truth stacking, which is that you have to validate, and then you have to find the narrative crumbs to lead somebody over time to a different belief or perception, and hopefully behavior change. This is, in fact, what the right wing does. I've talked to people that were at Cambridge Analytica. I've talked to people that were involved in a whole bunch of different long-term persuasion things. You look at who you can affect slowly over time. This is what the Maha movement was about, identifying that there was a wedge, there was some wiggle room amongst the sort of yoga wellness set in terms of vaccines. They found that wedge, they slowly worked at it over time, and look at what you have now. You have a whole movement based on this one little wedge that they saw. So those wedges are out there for us as well. But for some reason, we're not acting on them. I think that we have a huge wedge with a lot of conspiracy communities. I think there are a lot of people out there who are very adept at pattern recognition, who are looking for, they can see what's happening. They can see, for instance, I love to talk about people that believe in chemtrails, right? They can see something in the sky. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't look right. And what they're noticing is real. If you would just validate that, I see what you're seeing. I see what you're seeing. That does look alarming. So we looked into it, and guess what it really is? It really is contrails, which again are using our sky like an open sewer. It's not the chemtrails that you think. It's the fact that we have made a decision, I guess, as a society that we're going to allow this level of pollution to just be poured into our atmosphere. You are seeing pollution. It is affecting your health, right? So that's just like an overly small version of what that might look like. But those bridges are there to build. It just takes a long-term focus, and it takes a degree of like love and compassion. Instead of writing somebody off and saying, oh, you stupid person for believing in chemtrails, or you're so stupid for this. Instead, seeing a highly inquisitive mind who is adept at pattern recognition, who's unfortunately just being given the wrong facts, right? And so it is true that facts are important, but it's about the mechanism of delivery, and it's about the relationship that you're opening up with the person.
As you practice, facts only work when they're embedded in stories that have a moral worldview.
Yeah.
And that's the key thing. Now, we also repel a lot of people with our language and our rigidity and our dogmatism, defund the police, the incredible overemphasis on gender and gay and trans issues. Those are very valid, very important issues. All these people, everyone has the right to be themselves without oppression or discrimination. But if you overfocus on the parts of a whole and not on the whole, you don't win, because you only win by putting the whole together against your opponents. You know, I like to say that if Franklin Roosevelt, when he had proposed Social Security, had said, well, we're going to give a disproportionate amount of this money to the poor or to people of a certain group, he never would have gotten Social Security passed. And in getting it passed, it's done more to get all groups out of poverty than any other program in American history. Whereas I fear today, the left would be fighting itself. Well, you know, more should go to this group, more should go to that group. And while, yes, there's some understandable reasons you would think that or look at that, if you do that, you're hurting yourself because you don't assemble a majority. You know, the great Black Panther leader, Fred Hampton, was assassinated by the FBI in Chicago in, I think, 1969 or 70. And many of us believe the reason they killed him is he coined this term Rainbow Coalition. And
Right.
he was organizing white working class and Appalachian groups in Chicago, Chicano Latino street gangs into one whole coalition against oppression. And that's really dangerous. So they killed him.
Yeah.
And Martin Luther King was starting to do that too, to go into unifying everyone against militarism and poverty rather than only deal with civil rights, which of course he accomplished so much in. So we have to keep this in mind and balance the needs of our constituent parts with the more important thing of having a whole that can win. Would you agree?
I agree. I think I agree with most of that. I think that you know, it's definitely something that I saw happening in real time, certainly in the reproductive rights movement. There were the thing that immediately comes to mind is there was a study. I won't say what the name of the organization was. There was a prominent reproductive rights group, and they did a year-long study. And there was a super winning message that came out of this study. I mean, it had something like well over 80% of agreement, which, as you know, is really difficult to get people in the United States to agree on 80% over anything. And I still remember, I believe I remember verbatim the winning message, which was, good people can disagree on when life begins, but one thing we can all agree on is that we don't want the federal government making healthcare decisions about our bodies. We thought, that's incredible. Why don't we make a quick piece of media? So we went and got a grant. We made a piece of media so we can test it. Because sometimes you test a message in a more academic process, it doesn't live in the same way on the internet. You can really find out quite quickly whether a message really succeeds on the internet. Well, we made a video and it succeeded on the internet as well. We took this back to them. Look at this. We should be saturating this message all across the country. This is the winning message. And that organization never ran with that message because too many people internally on their staff had a problem with the words, good people can disagree on when life begins.
Right. How dumb. How sad.
And there were other things in there in the study too that never made the light of day because they didn't like where people were at. And I think this is a really big mistake.
Yeah.
After we lost Roe v. Wade and we were involved in some of these ballot fights, someone wisely resurfaced this study and began running ads utilizing some of that language in the midst of different ballot fights in different states, and they won every time.
Yeah.
So this is, again, a validation first. You have to validate that not everybody feels exactly the way you do about something, and that morality truly can be very, very personal. And also, people can contain multitudes. A lot of the language that we were using around abortion did not resonate with most women. Shout your abortion. A lot of women have very complex feelings about abortion.
Of course.
They might be simultaneously deeply committed to it staying legal and available, but also may feel bad about their own, or they may feel liberated by it, or they may feel shame about it, or they may feel all of those things at the same time. People contain multitudes. So you have to get, if there was one thing that I could shake the progressive movement, do it just be like, well, you have to start accepting and really loving the vast complexity of human beings and start talking to people where they're at. When I talk about truth stacking, it just means that, like, you don't hit somebody over the head with everything that you think they should think. You actually have to go through a process to lead somebody to a different behavior shift or to a worldview shift. It's not something that you can just do by running ads at them and doing 12 to 15 to 20 touch points. That's not going to get you the votes that you need. That's not going to get you the world and the country that we need. We have to have a much more cohesive, much more complex, long-term plan about how to get this country back on track and back to a more equal place. And without that kind of investment, without that kind of vision, I fear that we're going to be in this quagmire for a very long time to come.
Amen. Laura, in the few minutes we have left, tell us a little about you. Where do you come from? How did you get on this path? Or did you grow up in a progressive household? How did you change? Tell us briefly your story.
Well, I was born I'm from Pleasantville, Iowa. Population 1,000. I think there's still only 1,000 people there. At least when I was growing up, that was about it. One of those towns that doesn't have any stoplights where you can ride your horse into town, which I did all the time. I used to park my horse at the town library. My dad is both my parents are sadly gone now. My dad was never had more than a 9th grade education. He came from generations of the meatpacking industry, union guy. So he also ran our small farm. He did custom butchering. He also broke horses. He trained horses as a side hustle. So he was kind of like a Marlboro Man type. And my mom did finish high school, and she ended up working at a place called Syntex Agribusiness and the Meredith Corporation. So she just did data entry. I was the first person in my family to go to college, and I also then went to New York City right out of college and became a recording artist. So I had
A singer.
I was a singer, and for a long time that was sort of like, I thought, hopefully my ticket getting out of Iowa, which it was to a certain degree, but I'd always been really political. Ever since my dad, so there's a great documentary by Barbara Koppel, I think called Hearts and Minds, about the breakup of the unions, the meatpacking unions in the Midwest. And one of those unions was my dad's. He went to work one day. He'd put in 13 years, I think, at Filan's, and the doors were padlocked because they hadn't been able to break their union. They'd been on strike. Doors were padlocked. They stole their final paycheck, stole 13 years of a pension that he'd paid into. And the whole thing just dissolved overnight. And it was never a union protected job again. It used to be enough for a man we had a family of 5, and he took pretty good care of us. And he was never able to make, I think, over like $7 an hour after that. So they basically cut the pay of those workers in half, and all their protections and all their health insurance and all of that. So the idea that could happen really resonated with me and always stuck with me. And the first way I just said, I reject all America. I'm just going to go be an artist. I'm going to go sing and travel the world, and I want nothing to do with this. The whole system's corrupt. The kind of thing that you do in your 20s, like, fuck the whole thing, But then who got me into politics? This is very strange, but it was Howard Dean. I don't know if anyone remembers Howard Dean.
The governor of Vermont who ran for president.
Yeah, he really caught my ear, and was the first time I heard somebody saying something that really resonated with me, that I really thought was interesting. And I thought, I'm going to go see him when he speaks in New York City. Now, I'd spent my entire 20s being an independent artist, which means you're booking, back in those days, there's no internet. You're booking your own tours. I toured the whole country. I had a development deal at that time, which ended up being a record deal. Anyway, I went to volunteer for Howard Dean, and it was really quite messy. They did not have their entire volunteer tent very well organized. There was press showing up. Nobody knew what to happen. And I was just like, this is a mess. I just took over. I set up a press thing. I don't know what happened. I just took over and I just organized the whole thing. And they were like, who are you? I was like, I don't know. I just did it. And they were they were very gracious and had a lot of gratitude that I got it organized for them. And then I just kind of realized that you could do that. Like, you could make a difference just by being somebody who knew how to get things done. And so then the next strange thing was happened is that I met somebody that was working at this brand new organization called Move On. And I wanted to know about this. And Move On did something that I know you were connected to, which was that you guys created an ad, the Daisy ad, and you asked regular people to donate small amounts to run it on TV. Right. I thought this was genius. It filled me with such hope, like this idea that people could aggregate just what they could give, but it amount into something powerful that got a lot of attention. That was really, that really filled me with hope, and I wanted to be a part of that. And you know the rest. I basically badgered Move On. I badgered Move On until they hired me.
And so great. That's how we met. Mm-hmm. Well, great, Laura. Thank you for taking time with us. I think that if we're going to save democracy and we're going to save a livable earth for our children, then people on our team need to wise up and start doing effective communications, investing in it, meeting people where they're at, talking to them, building up these parasocial influencers of our own, and joining the modern world and getting over this idea that communications is dirty. Actually, right now, it runs the world. So if you want to help affect what happens to the world, you better be on people's phones or you do not exist. Amen, right?
Yeah, amen. And I think that, I think people are starting to say this now, but trust is the new currency.
Right.
Trust is the new currency. There's a real proliferation of stuff all over the internet. Now you've got AI slop and everything else. So you have to be investing in communications. You have to think of yourself as a communications company, and you have to be investing in methods of communication that build trust and relationship. You can't just keep talking down to people. You can't just keep talking at people and expect anything to change. So that's the long, hard work that I think that social justice movements used to really understand and used to be the best at. And somehow,
it's true. You know, in the 60s when I was coming up, I studied people who had mass audiences. They were very intentional about going on television and reaching people to turn them against the war and to get rid of segregation and to protect the environment. That they knew what they were doing. And we've lost that in part because we now have a professional NGO nonprofit world. And back then, everybody was just grassroots activists. There was nothing else.
Well, there was talent there too. Talent would rise to the top. I think one thing that you and I have always shared, which makes us a little bit outsiders in this world, is that because neither one of us, I don't have a PhD and you don't either, right?
I'm a high school dropout.
Yeah. So it's about, because I came to this from such a weirdly pure place, and it was never sort of my professional dream to do this, and then it became my profession. All I've been able to pay attention to is what works. Right. That's the only thing that I'm interested in. what works. And if something's not working, I want to know why. And I also feel there's some chip missing there. We need a level of self-reflection and accountability within our movements that I think somehow got lost as well. We need to be able to be humble enough to say, if this isn't working, what would work? How can we adjust course and create the conditions for a better world for everybody? Because the alternative here is getting pretty dark. So.
Well, that's a very good way to end. Thank you so much, Laura, for being on the Fenton Forecast. And if you want to reach Laura, you can write to hello@fentonforecast.com, hello@fentonforecast.com. Laura's website is artnotwar.org. .com, artnotwar.com. And thank you, Laura. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
We'll have to do this again. There's a lot more to talk about.